Mayo Clinic presents
Emergency Medicine Grand Rounds.
Hello, and welcome back to Always on EM, a podcast from the Mayo Clinic Department of Emergency Medicine. My name is Venk Bellamkonda. I co-host this show with Alex Finch. We have so much fun recording this and bringing these chapters to you twice each month. Some of them are special to us. This is one of those very special shows because it's our last show of the academic year 2024, and so we will be celebrating our graduating senior EM residents. Every class is special. They have their own culture, their own triumphs, their own challenges. This one is comprised of 9 exceptional people who seem to really bond with each other through it all. Collectively, I can say they are kind, brilliant, innovative, creative, funny, and hardworking. And we will miss them in Mayo Clinic Rochester very much. But we will also smile wide every time we hear of the many sure-to-come accomplishments. So cheers to you, Drs. Rebecca Leff, Adiba Matten, David Kerner, Dougie Moss, Michael Stevens, Alex Buchholz, Daria Hunter, Sarah Sutherland, and Matthew Hamilton. I left Dr. Hamilton for last because, representing his class, I thought it made sense to share his remarkable senior capstone presentation as the show's Grand Rounds talk for you this month. So, to provide the more formal introduction of Dr. Matthew Hamilton, here is the all-world Dr. Annie Sadasti.
Welcome to Grand Rounds. So I have the privilege of introducing today's Grand Rounds speaker, Dr. Matthew Hamilton. I wanted to punctuate the beginning by doing it twice. So Dr. Hamilton grew up in a small town, Delano, Minnesota, which I've grown to know is a suburb of the Twin Cities. By suburb, I mean a small suburb with oak savannas and wildflower prairies, and a great fodder for childhood for adults and children. After graduating from Delano, he went on to begin his education at the London College of Fashion, where he studied fashion for a year and then recalibrated a bit and came back to Minnesota, went to Hamline University for his undergraduate degree, and then went to the University of Minnesota at Duluth for his medical school training. And then through a sheer stroke of luck and good fortune, we were able to recruit him to Mayo Clinic Emergency Medicine, where he has been performing admirably in his role as a resident in our training program. He has accomplished so much, and to distill it into a few words is hard to do, but I'll share a few highlights. He's conducted research on falls in the elderly, and while it was a required pursuit, he won an award at the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine for the research. It's meaningful research, and it was awarded as such. He's led within the residency as the wellness chair, and I think the residents will speak to the value that has brought to them and to the program. As I think about Matt, and I know him very well, and I've been privileged to really get to know him, I am struck by this long tradition of advocacy, and you see it in the space of Indigenous people. You see it in the space of homeless, unsheltered people, and you see it in the space of people who identify as LGBTQ and more. He's an absolutely phenomenal emergency physician, and if I had a magic wand, some would say I do. I think he's ready to graduate, but that's not mine to determine. It's others to determine. He's really a phenomenal emergency physician, and all of us know that when we work alongside of him. Today's talk on the history of homosexuality in medicine is incredible. I've had a preview, and you're in for a real treat. So please welcome Dr. Matthew Hamilton to the podium for what will be a great hour.
So thank you, Dr. Sadasti, and thank you all for being here. Very excited to talk about two subjects really that are near and dear to my heart. One being the LGBTQ community, and the other being medicine and the medical community. This project really started out as being a history of homosexuality in medicine, and it really morphed into a history more broadly of the LGBTQ community. I think that's kind of best encapsulated in the kind of more modernized version of the pride flag behind the symbol of medicine here. This is the kind of newer pride flag. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, was released in 2018. And it essentially highlights the kind of intersectionality between gender, sexuality, with gender and transgendered people being kind of highlighted with the white, pink, and blue lines up top, and then the intersectionality of gender and sexuality with race, with the brown and black lines here, just highlighting the important impacts in LGBTQ history that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have made as well. And so the reason I want to give this talk today is for people to be able to recognize pivotal moments in LGBTQ history. It's a history that's not often taught in schools, and a lot of people just don't quite understand and don't quite know because nobody shared with them kind of the history of where things arose and how we got to where we are today. Through that, also discussing structural mechanisms that excluded predominantly gay people from medicine for over 150 years. And through that, being able to recognize that these same structural mechanisms that excluded gay people also can be used to exclude many other minority groups from medicine as well. And then lastly, being able to recognize and mitigate some of the ongoing threats to the health and well-being of LGBTQ people. So to start, we'll talk first about the history of homosexuality really throughout civilization, because really since the dawn of civilization, there's the earliest recorded writings about homosexuality from literally the dawn of civilization in Mesopotamia. 4,000 years ago, there are written laws that acknowledge same-sex male and female relationships in Mesopotamia. About 2,700 years ago, there's a well-documented same-sex couple that are not only recognized in their community, but also hold high standing in the Zhou dynasty in China. If you fast forward a bit to the 1800s in what is now Minnesota, up by Leech Lake, French fur traders meet a person named Oza Windib. He's a Ojibwe person who dresses in women's garb, but still maintains some male roles in society and has multiple long-term male partners throughout his life. And then lastly, in England, in 1834, we have an example of Anne Lister marrying another woman in the Holy Trinity Church in York, England. All of this to say that across different civilizations and really across time since the dawn of civilization, what we now consider and what we now know of as homosexuality or same-sex relationships have existed. Now, the origins of modern homosexuality start in 1868 with this gentleman, Carl Kurtbenny, who coins the term homosexual and heterosexual to give language to, same-sex relationships. In about 20 years later, in a text called the Psychopathia Sexualis, with the dawn of psychiatry, a German psychiatrist describes homosexuality in the first kind of written sense as being a mental illness, being a sexual psychopathy. As is kind of in vogue for the time, it was thought that it was a eugenic issue and that it was the term they used was degenerate heredity, meaning it was one of many illnesses that they thought could be bred out of the population through eugenics. Just around the same time in the United States, we have a very important person named William Dorsey Swann. He was born into slavery in the American South, and after emancipation moved to Washington, D.C. He is the first self-described drag queen, dressing in women's clothing that was very popular in the antebellum South prior to this time. He is also notably the first American to sue for LGBT rights with the federal government. He was imprisoned for 10 months in the federal penitentiary for allowing homosexuals to gather at his home. He and his lawyer actually petitioned for a pardon from the United States President Grover Cleveland. That pardon was denied, but he was released after serving 6 months of a prison term. He would go on to be very active in the gay community that was still very much underground until his death in 1924. After he died, the local officials in Washington, D.C. Got a mob together that unfortunately burned down his home. And so really all physical records other than some photographs of his legacy were lost. In the 1930s, we have Dr. Alfred Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute examining more objectively human sexuality. He is known for publishing the Kinsey scale of sexuality, which theorizes that sexuality is a spectrum, and some people are heterosexual, some people are homosexual. And he proposes that homosexuality is natural, but he does say that it is, quote, not ideal. If we fast forward a bit to the post-World War II era in the United States, there is a kind of fever pitch of paranoia around counterculture, around communism, creatives, liberalism, and with that, around homosexuality. On the left, you can see a document from the 1950s in what is now known as the Lavender Scare. This was an initiative started by the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the time to root out homosexuality and suspected homosexuals from really all levels of government. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the federal government discharged over 4,000 men suspected of being homosexuals from the military. They fired 420 people from the federal government for being suspected homosexuals and denied over 1,700 applications for employment in the federal government due to suspicion that the people who were applying were homosexual. In addition to the federal government having tried to exclude and persecute homosexuals, this was also a very common trend in higher education around this time as well. This is in the below center clip from the University of Texas, Austin newspaper after the president of that institution was fired for not doing enough to expel homosexual students from the university. Over 5 different universities at this time have had kind of well-documented investigations and expulsions of homosexual students, including the University of Wisconsin in Madison and Harvard, which have both since issued apologies to the community as a whole, but then also to the men who were expelled, and in many cases, men whose lives were never the same again. And right around this same time, on the right, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM. This is the first DSM that's published in 1952, and in it, they formally classify homosexuality as a mental illness. They classify it under a larger umbrella of sociopathic personality disturbances and sexual psychopathy. They combine it with pedophilia, fetishism, bestiality, and transvestitism. As we'll talk about shortly, it would remain a mental disorder for over 20 years. And during this time of intensifying post-World War II civil unrest, we have a real fever pitch of civil rights activism, of organization, of Black and brown people, of women, and minority populations as a whole organizing and fighting for recognition. In this same time, we have the first, albeit small, organizations organizing for same-sex couples and for gay, lesbian, and transgender people to no longer be seen as deviant or diseased, and for the community to have the same rights as heterosexual and cisgendered people. If we follow through the 60s, we reach the late 1960s, where in the kind of peak of counterculture in the United States, we have a riot at the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay social club, they had to call it. It was not a bar. The New York would not give a liquor license to establishments where they were known hangouts for homosexuals, so they were not a bar. The night of June 28th, 1969, the New York Police Department raided the Stonewall Inn, and the transgender and gay and lesbian people who were in the bar noted that that night was particularly brutal, particularly violent, and the unrest spilled out into the street and began what is now known as the Stonewall riots. This was a 3-day protest where essentially the LGBTQ community had just had it with being with ostracized, being beaten, and being basically just harassed. And so now every June we have the Gay Pride Parade in late June, and that is a kind of commemoration of the Stonewall riots and the start of fighting for recognition and respect in a broader America. And then we fast forward into the 1970s, and the gay community is starting to organize more and more. This is Harvey Milk. He was one of the earliest publicly elected officials in the United States. He was a city council member in San Francisco. He was elected in 1977. Sadly, in 1978, he was murdered along with the mayor of San Francisco by a fellow city council member who was noted to harbor a lot of resentment towards the homosexual community in San Francisco. But during all of this time, the gay community is organizing and becoming more cohesive and more welcoming and more resilient. Unfortunately, in the early 1980s, we have the first reported cases of what would ultimately become known as HIV and AIDS. In New York City and in Los Angeles and San Francisco, there are the first reported cases of Kaposi sarcoma, of CMV pneumonia, and pneumocystis pneumonia. This would, in the early 1980s, first be called GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency disease. In the early 80s, there was thought that this was some kind of gay cancer, something associated inherently with being gay. Ultimately, it would not be termed human immunodeficiency virus for several years. And during this time, as more and more gay and transgender people test positive for HIV and are showing signs of AIDS, the gay community as a whole organizes, and there are many kind of public protests upset at the federal government for seeming indifference to human disease and human suffering. For example, the presidential administration at the time would not say the words HIV or AIDS for a full 5 years into the epidemic. These types of demonstrations, including die-ins like this one in the 1980s and the early 90s, reached fever pitch when gay protesters are protesting the National Institutes of Health, which is newly directed at that time by none other than a young Anthony Fauci, seen here on the left. At this time, the organizers meet with the Food and Drug Administration and with the National Institutes of Health and are largely credited with advancing by several years the speeding up of the process to find drugs that would ultimately become available in the 1990s. The first drugs being known as highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HART. AZT is the first, released in 1987, and unfortunately, people develop very rapid resistance to just monotherapy. Integrase inhibitors are discovered in 1995, and you can see that with combination use, the mortality rate and the incidence of new infections begins to drop. Unfortunately, by this time, over 10% of gay men between the ages of 25 and 44, really in the time of the peak of their lives, would die of AIDS. 1 in 9 gay men would be diagnosed with AIDS, and nearly 300,000 people had died in the United States by 1995. During this time, people are starting to see this as what it is, and it was really a tragedy of humanity. Gay people are seen less as a vector or a sickness, and started to be seen more during this time as human. A photography series by a photographer named Gideon Mendel in 1993 showcased events at an AIDS ward in the United Kingdom, where a man is being comforted by his partner in bed, and another where clinicians look on as a man is in bed in this AIDS ward dying of HIV. At this time, people are starting to soften to the idea of AIDS and HIV and the fear of gay people. For example, in the late 1980s, as much as 50% of primary care physicians said that they would not want to take care of a HIV or AIDS positive person if they had the choice. And in 1990, about 24% of physicians felt like it should be optional for clinicians to have to care for HIV and AIDS positive patients. Thankfully, much like in our own pandemic with COVID-19, there were thousands of brave and compassionate clinicians, researchers, pharmacists, and nurses who cared for these people. And over time, we can see in the United States softening attitudes on homosexuality through the AIDS pandemic, through fights for equality, through repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, through repealing gay marriage bans across the United States. Now, roughly 70 to 80% of Americans approve of homosexuality, but still important to note that about 25 to 30% of people still disapprove. Largely, since the mid-90s, a lot of credit has been given to popular culture for normalizing gay and lesbian people across mass media in the United States, starting in the 1990s with Ellen DeGeneres being the first celebrity to come out, and then a year later, Will and Grace going on the air, showing 2 gay people living normal, successful, happy, healthy lives. Things like this would be, in retrospect, looked at as a major turning point in popular culture for seeing gay people as just like everybody else. In 2015, we have Obergefell v. Hodges, the United States Supreme Court decision, which is a 5-4 decision ruling that gay marriage bans in the United States were unconstitutional and declaring same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. Today, about 36 countries have formally recognized and legalized same-sex marriage. There are, unfortunately, countries that it still remains deadly to be homosexual. 2 countries have formally and active death penalties for homosexuality, those being Iran and Afghanistan. Other countries, predominantly in West Africa, Somalia, Saudi Arabia, it remains punishable by prison, and oftentimes there are extrajudicial or militia type executions of gay people. So though we have made significant amounts of progress, we still certainly have a lot of progress to go before we finish writing the history of LGBT people. So I want to pivot now to talking about how LGBTQ people found a place within the ranks of medicine. Really, this starts in the 1970s with a man wearing a Richard Nixon mask in the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. At the time, he goes by the name Dr. Anonymous. He would later come out as Dr. John Fryer. He is a board certified practicing faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry at Temple University. And they are, during this year, rewriting the DSM to publish DSM-2. He says in this Richard Nixon mask during the discussion that he is a homosexual and he's also a psychiatrist. He advocates for removing homosexuality from the DSM, and he is successful in this. And when they publish the DSM-2, homosexuality is no longer listed as a mental illness. He's the first recorded practicing physician who came out as homosexual. He later goes on to say that leading up to this discussion, he had already been thrown out of residency, had already lost a job because he was gay, and he felt that his perspective needed to be from a gay psychiatrist to other psychiatrists for them to fully understand. And in the state of Minnesota, like many others, the main thing that kept gay people from practicing medicine, from practicing law and teaching were sodomy laws. You might remember from your filling out your Minnesota medical license, you have to answer a series of questions of yes, no. Do you have any chemical dependency issue, mental illness, etc., that prevents you from practicing medicine? Prior to 2001, there was a question that asked if you were engaged in devious sexual activity such as homosexuality, sodomy, and in that same sentence, which is still there today, but the sentence today asks about, are you a pedophile? Are you an exhibitionist? In that same sentence, homosexuality was right there next to them. So in 2001, a group of 9 different plaintiffs, a combination of anonymous and named plaintiffs, at least one of whom was a physician, one was a lawyer, and there were a couple other ones who were teachers. They sued the state of Minnesota, claiming that the sodomy laws are an undue burden, invade their privacy, and they're barriers to being able to practice in medicine, law, and in teaching. Ultimately, this law is declared unconstitutional by a state justice. And I kid you not, up until 2001, gay people could not be physicians in the state of Minnesota and hold a medical license because you were breaking a law, and you, in checking no on every single medical license, you were being dishonest by saying that you were not a homosexual. This was decided more broadly across the entire United States in 2003 when a Supreme Court case strikes down sodomy laws across the United States, citing very similar reasons to the logic for striking this down in the state of Minnesota. So around 2003, we have kind of broad changes in the professions that many gay people feel like they are welcome, if not at least not in jeopardy if they go into them. Now, some interesting parts of what was happening at Mayo Clinic during this time come from my discussions with Luke Wood about my grand rounds. So his father, Dr. Michael Wood, was actually the CEO of Mayo during this time, and I had the privilege of talking to Dr. Michael Wood about his experience during this time. He mentioned that this was kind of a pivotal time where things were changing in the Mayo Clinic institutionally, where there were physicians who many people suspected were gay, but were, certainly could not come out at work about it. But Mayo Clinic and the leadership wanted to create some sort of same-sex couple benefits for people to be able to share things like health insurance, retirement benefits, tax benefits that they could not enjoy because same-sex marriage was not yet legal. And so he was the CEO when Mayo Clinic implemented these policies. And generally, across Mayo, things were fairly well received. He did note, though, that in Rochester as a whole, things were kind of less welcome. There were quite a few protests raised in the press, and then he said on multiple occasions he would wake up to bags of dog poop or plates of dog poop on his front porch. Thankfully, really nothing more than that arose from the situation. And Mayo Clinic, really from the very early times of when it was legal to be gay and be a physician, was very supportive of gay physicians, much as they are now. Along this same timeline, physician attitudes on homosexuality have been improving. So the earliest research that we have on asking physicians what their thoughts are of if homosexual people should be admitted to medical school come from research in the early 80s, where at the time a group of physicians in San Diego sent a survey out to all of the practicing physicians in California, notably even at that time to still be on the more progressive end of states. And at that time, 31% in 1982 said that they would be opposed to well-qualified homosexual people being admitted to medical schools. They repeated this same survey in 1999, and that number dropped to 7%. They lasted this in 2017, and now it's just less than 1% who said that they would oppose homosexual people being admitted to medical schools. There are a number of different influential organizations of physicians who have also come out with recommendations on the LGBT community and medical education. The 2015 American College of Physicians report recommended that medical schools and residencies have dedicated LGBTQ curriculum, and they emphasize that we need more LGBTQ people in medicine. However, LGBTQ people still feel largely invisible in medical education, with only 20% of medical schools as of 2022 collecting sexual orientation data on applicants, and about 73% allowing for gender responses other than male or female. It's important to note that, this is a difficult thing where should people necessarily feel obligated to come out in a medical school application? I don't think so, but and it's kind of tricky when the person reading your application may not approve of being homosexual or being transgender and may very well look over your application in favor of the exact same application coming from a cisgender or heterosexual applicant. So I'm not entirely sure what the right move is as far as do we require or do we recommend that all schools collect that information? But it's also important to note that once in medicine, there's a lot of research that LGBT people don't feel welcome across all specialties. And that's really a combination of not having enough mentors, not having enough transgender or lesbian or gay physicians, or at least physicians who are out in specialties where they can identify with that person and see themselves in that specialty. In 2022, there was research published that polled gender diverse and gay and lesbian medical students, and there was increased perception of surgical specialties as not being as welcome to the LGBTQ community as fields primarily in primary care where people felt like they were more welcome. As far as psychological safety in medicine, up to 2/3 of LGBTQ physicians report overhearing disparaging remarks at work about other LGBTQ people, and 1/3 have reported witnessing discrimination towards LGBTQ patients. And we know through multiple published works that LGBTQ physicians choose institutions and specialties that they feel safe in. Mayo Clinic's efforts on this are ongoing and include the Mayo Employee Resource Group for LGBT employees, and also the Outlist, where you will find me as as out on that list of people who have voluntarily disclosed their membership as being LGBT, so that people who are interested in potentially joining a department can find a familiar face in that and reach out, ask questions, or just feel like they have some sense of community. So now to talk about where we are at with healthcare and our LGBT patients. Unfortunately, there are still a great deal of health inequities in the LGBT community. And I hope that you all feel empowered through this next part to better care for LGBT patients. And if you overhear or are subject to hearing disparaging or discriminatory remarks about LGBT patients, remember these facts as to why your care matters. So today, LGBT youth are twice as likely to be homeless, largely because they're running away from families who may not be accepting or may be overtly hostile and kick them out for being gay or lesbian or transgender. Gay people are 4 times more likely to experience suicidal ideation and twice as likely to attempt suicide compared to their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts per age group. And unfortunately, in the United States, LGBT people account for 20% of all reported hate crimes, despite accounting for anywhere between 6 and 10% of the general population. And it's important to note, too, that when the person's gender identity or sexuality intersects with other minority statuses like being Black or Indigenous or a person of color, these things confound together to create just extremely disproportionate health outcomes. In 2023, the Center for Disease Control announced that their latest research was that 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men will contract HIV in their lifetime. This is despite us having very effective means of preventing HIV transmission like pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's also important to note that transgender patients, 1 in 4 of them report avoiding or delaying care for fear of discrimination in the healthcare setting. This remains true even in emergency medicine. Yale and OHSU had just published a report in 2022 where they asked about 40 gender diverse patients who had received care in the emergency department if they thought of not going in or delaying care. And about 50% of those 40 people in the study reported delaying care for fear of discrimination in the emergency department. And lastly, on the whole, LGBT people are 2 to 4 times more likely to have a chronic disease. Below the age of 44, they have twice the chronic disease burden. Above the age of 45, they have 4 times the chronic disease burden compared to their heterosexual counterparts. And even outside of the hospital, outside of the clinic, there are ongoing threats to LGBTQ health and safety. Just last year, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security released an alert to the LGBTQ community, citing increased risk of domestic terrorism. We unfortunately saw this in 2016 with the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, where 50 LGBT people were shot and killed in a gay nightclub. And again in 2022 in Colorado, when a person with pretty intense preceding very hateful remarks online walked into a Colorado gay bar and murdered 9 people in a gay bar. And then we have kind of a resurgence of political initiatives to kind of fight back against some of the progress made in the LGBTQ community. We had, the wave of bathroom bills, as they were termed, and then more recently, last year in Florida, a bill that legalized medical discrimination, essentially, against LGBTQ people. So this was a bill that authorized people who had a moral objection to treating LGBTQ people, including paramedics in the pre-hospital setting, to physicians and pharmacists, allowing them to not care for LGBTQ people if it violated their moral or ethical code. I would counter this by just saying that we are the group that treats anyone, anywhere, anytime. And I shudder to think that, bills like this spread much farther than the current bill in place in Florida, as in my mind, this is completely antithetical to why really any of us go into healthcare. And so what can you do? This is what it's really all about. And it essentially comes down to being an ally. It comes down to having an understanding of the history of, how we got to where we are today in the sense of gay and lesbian and transgender people in medicine, and then how we got today to a place where there's higher mental health disease burden, higher chronic disease burden in the LGBT community. And when things happen in healthcare, in this emergency department, in other emergency departments that you'll work in the future, I hope that you have an understanding and have some deeper knowledge now that empowers you to speak out if you hear something, see something that may have the effect of perpetuating discrimination against LGBTQ people in medicine. So, in conclusion, I hope that you've gained an understanding of LGBTQ history and kind of the fight for respect and for civil rights in the United States, and understand some of the structural barriers for LGBT people in health inequity and LGBTQ people in medicine, and see the importance of why more work is needed for LGBTQ people to feel welcome in healthcare, both as physicians, nurses, allied healthcare staff, but also as patients, and to understand that LGBTQ people continue to face health inequities, including higher risks of hate crime and violence in the United States and really across the world. So, this talk is one that I was inspired to do by really having just a couple of very important gay mentors in medicine. I've had the privilege of having a couple. I wish it was many more, but I'm where I am today and comfortable where I am today, thanks to that and thanks to, this department. So I hope you all feel like you've, gained some perspective, and hope you feel more empowered to take good care of my community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton, for your efforts in giving this presentation and really for letting us be a part of your training journey. It's been a wonderful experience for me, and I believe all of us teachers in Rochester would feel the same way. So that's a wrap on this academic year, and Alex and I are thrilled to get ready to start the next one. We are excited to welcome this new class of residents coming in, and we will introduce them to you very soon. To all of you tuning in, as always, we thank you for listening to our show. Join us July 1st for some more sensational emergency medicine content, and until then, be safe.
The Always On EM Podcast.
Emergency Medicine Grand Rounds.